Welcome to Navigating Journalism, the Power of Information, a special presentation of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, Ohio Valley Chapter and Central Great Lakes Chapter. I'm Dan Spieler, the Communications and Membership Chair with the Central Great Lakes Chapter, and we're so honored to be joined by our esteemed panel today. Alyssa Yancey, the Executive and Creative Director with A Picture's Worth, Chip Mahaney, longtime news manager now at Southern Methodist University, and Kris Cundiff with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press in Indiana. That's going to be a big topic today, freedom of the press, your rights, your responsibilities as a journalist. But first, let's meet the panel here today. And Alyssa, I'll start with you. The importance of journalism, the importance of information and storytelling in this modern age. What inspires you in journalism? What do we need to do better?
Oh, well, that's a meaty question to start off with. What inspires me is just what's always inspired me. So journalism is such a great and important vehicle for education for our communities and to really let people know what's going on, what they need to be aware of, and to really preserve our democracy. So I think especially now, I feel like I say that every day in the past year, but especially now it's important for people to understand their rights, what information they are entitled to know, and how they can use that information to make their lives better.
Chip, what are your thoughts on that front?
I'm going to beg off for a second. I'm getting double feedback on here and I'm trying to resolve that. So I'll get back to you.
All right. And Kris, your role with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press is a really important one we're going to talk about today in terms of what journalists need to know, what their rights are. Tell us a little bit about what your organization does.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. So the Reporters Committee is a nonprofit organization that's headquartered in Washington, D.C. And, our principal mission is providing free legal support and representation to journalists and newsrooms across the country. And we do that in various ways, including direct representation, amicus curiae support, but also through education, which I think is one of the important parts of what we do. And part of that is our guides and our legal hotline. So it provides a resource for journalists that are in the field if a legal issue comes up, whether that's public records, First Amendment, anything that applies to the news gathering side of the business. So journalists can focus on the work that they're doing. So those resources are all available, but that's a real quick version of what we do. But the long story short is we're here as a free resource to legal resource to journalists and newsrooms.
And Chip, obviously, a lot of this, more important than ever, journalism has always played an important role in our democracy, but a lot of people find this particular time to be a crucial one for our industry.
Well, I mean, I've lived long enough to have seen lots of generations of this in our democracy, right? And we've all gone through challenges. There was challenges in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and just being of a certain age tells me that I can put some of this in perspective. Now, that said, we have never seen a time like this. And forget the politics of it all. It's just the nature of the news cycle is diminished to about 12 and a half minutes. Like during this hour, there will be 4 news cycles. And dominated out of DC, but other places as well. And now we have social media, of course, and instantaneous media of all different levels created by the hands of people just like you and me, not journalists or trained or anybody. So that is the peculiarness of the world we live in 2026 is a massive news engine, some of which is utterly legit in terms of national security or the economy. And some of it is made up by people in power as well as people in the world we live in today. So yeah, we live in a very challenging world just to try to discern what is really happening and what is true.
And we'll talk about all of that. We want to remind you that we are hosting this as an interactive forum. So if you have any questions for our panel today, let us know in the comments on Facebook. Let us know in the comments on the YouTube clip, and we'll be sure to take those questions to our panel. We also want to thank all of the participating organizations joining us today, including the Ohio Association of Broadcasters, the Indiana Association of Broadcasters, and the Kentucky Broadcasters Association. So a lot of different groups sharing this great resource and this great conversation that we planned today. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and pass those along to our panel. Let's start with one of the questions here that we want to start off with in this day and age where we're talking about trust in the media and trust in what we do. Alyssa, I'll start with you on this question. Can you talk about how journalists can relay the information they learn to their communities in ways that can help build trust and support?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that because I have been a longtime journalist, journalism educator, and one of the things I do now as a nonprofit leader is work more directly and very closely with community. So I think it's critically important for journalists to center their communities when they report about everything, but in particular, as we're talking today about information that's hard for the general public and maybe not natural for the general public to access through Freedom of Information Act requests, it can be very natural for us on the journalistic side to center our work, the effort it took to get records, when in fact the work may mean very little to the audience, especially if they don't understand how what you have learned and what the point of your work is impacts their own lives, their own communities, and their futures. So today, when journalists have been defined and identified repeatedly as the enemy of the people, I think it's more essential than ever to remind audiences that our work is about them and their lives, not just our hard work and determination, right? And one other thing that I think audiences care a lot more about than even investigations, for good, for better, for ugly, is that you invest as much time in relationship building in community as you do in your investigations and filing FOIAs. Building trust takes time and care, and we are in an uphill struggle with so many streams, as Chip was talking about, of misinformation, disinformation, and claims of fake news. Community, the people you are in service of and to, will believe you if they know you and if you have a track record of showing up for them and being trustworthy.
And Chip, I think that's an advantage that local media has that maybe national media continues to struggle with. What are your thoughts on that? And what are some great examples you've seen of local journalists using public records to help build trust in their communities?
Yeah, I that's exactly it. And what Alyssa was saying was spot on. And local media does have that advantage. So today, this weekend, I'm in Dallas, Texas. And while it was warm earlier this week, we're about to get a pretty serious ice storm. And ice is nothing to be, no one can drive in ice, right? It is a bad, bad thing. So one thing that local media can always provide is we're out there with you in this. We're out there with you for this. And so when there's actual news that people can say, and yep, it's icing out there. Yes, it's 28 degrees. Yes, it's going to be 9 degrees. And we can find a source of common facts, right? The weather is a common fact. Forecast may not be, but the weather that's happening is. And so whenever we can build trust on things that are common facts, it's good. I always teach students, I tell the same thing to people I talk to. I focus, particularly in local news, on facts and multiple perspectives. And that's always been a decent way of trying to get at truth, or sometimes truths. But facts are the common denominator.
And certainly public records are a very big part of that, Kris. That's part of what your organization does, helping journalists in that quest for finding public records that really illuminate situations that otherwise people may not know about. Question for you, do you have any practical tips that you'd like to share today for journalists when requesting some of those public records? What's the best way to go about it, especially, to our younger journalists who might be watching this, or students who may not have done as much yet in that realm?
Yeah, sure. I think that one of the important parts of not only requesting, but the entire process of public records is having an understanding of the state and where you're working, or the state where you're trying to get information from or records from. because they all follow a similar, template. So one of the tips I would say is familiarize yourself the best you can with what your state or where you're reporting, what the law requires. And like I said, they all have similar application and so forth, but the different states. So I work in Indiana. It's important to make sure that, first of all, be patient, because that part of it is always a big part of the process, because it sometimes takes some time. But as far as practical tips, make sure that your request is specific. You don't have to be giving proper names of documents or records, but the more specific you are, the less vulnerable the request will be from the perspective of it's not specific enough. That's a common issue in Indiana, and I suspect it would be in other states as well. Indiana has a provision that requires request to identify the records with reasonable particularity. That varies depending on the agency, but the long story short is reasonable particularity in Indiana means giving the agency the ability to search for and locate what you're asking for. And so the more specific you can be, I think is one of the best tips right out of the gate. And also follow up. Follow up is a big part of it, because again, speaking from Indiana's perspective on this, there's not in the statute, in the law, there's not a time frame, I guess, that says the agency has to provide what you requested in so many days. So particularly with young journalists, I talk to student journalists all over the state. I always encourage them to stay as persistent and vigilant as they can in following up, because it's, depending on the agency, we can see that timeline start to stretch out, and it end up taking longer. So, squeaky wheel and so forth. But, be patient, be specific. I would recommend making those requests in writing and follow up regularly with the agencies you're requesting records from.
What is an acceptable period of time to wait for a record from a public agency? I mean, that can really vary widely in my experience through the years.
Yeah, sure. And Dan, you that is exactly part of the problem with such a broadly worded statute. So it varies. Certain records, so a reasonable time, if say you were asking for, the annual budget from last year or even this year, it's pretty straightforward. Where I think you start seeing timelines get a little more protracted is when when a journalist is requesting electronic communication, particularly emails. Anything that would have to be reviewed by legal counsel is going to take longer. And if the records themselves have both disclosable and non-disclosable information in them, then they'll have to be, more than likely, they'll have to be redacted after that review. So certain records take longer. So I wish I had an actual timeline that I could offer, but I always recommend a journalist, if it gets past 30 days, then especially with that follow-up part of it. But, run-of-the-mill records, like I said, standard stuff, it's a shorter timeline. I don't know what that is. It varies. But it depends partially on the size of the agency, how much or how many records, and if it requires legal review. So it varies. It depends. I know that's kind of a squishy answer, but it's the practical reality.
Well, I think we see that, and we see that playing out at the national level with this case involving the Epstein files that everybody seems to be following, and the pace at which something like that comes out. Chip, you've worked in television and journalism a long time, and you've seen that as well. Sometimes some records come out much faster than others.
Yeah, a couple of things I was going to add on to what was just said. It's always tough to go into anything that you need quickly and have never been there before. to try to find what it is you're looking for. You know, if you're going shopping for a red jacket and you've never shopped for a red jacket before, and you're in a place like Dallas in which there might be 5,000 stores, but you still can't find the perfect one, like, it's really hard to be expectant of some things. So part of this is what we've been talking about, or what we should be talking about, is around muscle memory, right? So I've worked with some beat reporters, I've worked with some investigative reporters, and the ones who are most successful about getting open records are the ones who do it all the time. So let's say you're a reporter assigned to a new beat. Maybe it's in a certain city. Maybe you're covering a suburb of a larger market. Maybe you're covering City Hall in a large city. Part of your weekly routine ought to be filing open records requests, and get the simple stuff, the stuff that they will give you right away, because you know how quickly they can turn around the non-controversial things when they want to. Like, if they turn around a record in 30 minutes, that's a good fact to have. Some point when they don't want to turn a record around quite so fast, right? Learn when they have to redact. You know, some of the biggest records that we deal with these days are body cam videos. And you should keep a record of, okay, well, they released this one in a moment when it seemed to serve their purpose. Yet why are they dragging their feet when the body cam might not show that agency in such a favorable light? You need to have that kind of institutional knowledge from previous experience. And you only get that by seeking it out. You know, doing a FOIA request your first day there, asking for, can I get some body cam video of that thing that happened last week? And it may not be controversial, but again, see if they turn it around quickly. And that way, when they don't the next time, you'll have a pretty good case to make, saying, listen, what's up here, guys?
Here in Indianapolis, whether the body camera video is controversial or whether it isn't particularly controversial, the police department here has a standard practice of issuing them on Friday afternoon, right before 5 p.m.
News dump day.
Exactly. Let's talk about transparency when it comes to seeking open records. How important is that, do you think, for journalists to really bring people in on that process, especially this day and age and in a time where journalism is questioned and scrutinized? How can journalists who are doing investigative reporting or reporting that involves open record requests use those records to really increase the credibility and trust among the audiences they serve? Alyssa, you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's so related, and I loved what Chip was advising as well. It's like what we're used to doing and the routines that we establish as journalists, and I'm saying that even though I call myself a recovering journalist these days, really sets the tone for relationship building, right? And I think so much of getting information is about who you know, what you know, and how to get that information in the easiest way possible to serve your audience. So I think the interesting thing about what Chip was saying is like, yeah, I want to get to know everybody. I want to know my community members, but I also want to know those people who are working in the offices with those records, because they need to see me as a familiar face and trust that I'm not out to get them. I'm just out to get to better information. So I think it's a kind of full circle and something that I think as journalists we really need to take seriously, the idea of the importance of transparency in our transactions with people we're trying to get information from, whether they're a public official or, likely as the case in these instances, people who are working in the offices who have some power and control over things, as well as our general community members, and how we can enlist the support of our own audiences in supporting our requests for information, because they know us, they trust us, and they want to hear what we're trying to find out.
Kris, do you think that's important for journalists to share with their audiences and say, hey, we've been waiting a month, we've been waiting 6 weeks, we've been waiting 8 weeks to get this records request?
Yes, absolutely. So, in another life before I went to law school, I worked as a news reporter in small market radio broadcasting. But yes, I know. So I have some experience on the journalistic side as well, but I think that's a crucial part of doing that. And I usually do not, because I'm not a journalist day to day anymore. I'm always reluctant to make recommendations about what would be good content. But I think that would be a major part of this, is letting people know, look, I've seen records requests in Indiana, Dan, where we're talking a year since the request was made, and the journalist still doesn't have what they requested, and there's no real clear reason why. I think that in itself becomes noteworthy and worth mentioning to the audience, to show, like, look, we're trying to get this information, and we're not able to do it. And that becomes, I think, in the public interest as well. So yeah, I agree.
Chip, what are your thoughts on that? And what are some good practical ways to kind of share that sort of information and bring the audience in on the process? How important do you think that is this day and age?
Yeah, in the video world, it's actually, I mean, you can do this on digital, you can do this in print, but on the video world, it's really always, it's great that you can do this, is that showing your work as you go, right? So we do this a couple different ways. And by the way, when we talk about open records, I think one of the things that we sometimes miss as journalists is that we're the only ones fighting for these open records, but really open records are available not just to the media, but to the public as a whole, right? And so if we're always acting like, by the way, people who might be watching this story, you can file the same request, because that's your right just as much. We're not special. We aren't. We're doing this because we have an interest in this, and we think you do too. But fact is, you can do the same thing we're doing. And then, a lot of the good stories that we've done have really shown the reporter at work. I worked with an investigative reporter in Cincinnati for several years, whose office was right outside my news director door. And I loved watching him, listening to him make calls, talking to local police chiefs and other administrative folks, trying to get records, and particularly video records, from reluctant departments. And our investigative reporter absolutely knew the law of the state, absolutely did, and far better often than they did, that's an advantage, but sometimes it can be a frustration when we know what the law says, but we can't get them to acknowledge it, much less follow it, or for whatever reason they're dragging their feet. But listening to, and by the way, then showing our audience how our reporter manages those conversations, those follow-up conversations. Chief, you and I know that this record needs to be produced, that you need to bring this record and let us see this, or let us have this. And then, but also watching him work it in a delicate but firm way. He's never browbeating anybody. He is actually walking that chief or that public records administrator into a place like, we're trying to work together. This is the law. We're entitled to this record, but doing it in a professional, competent, quiet sometimes way to build trust and to make sure, but also to stay firm.
What you said there about, this isn't just something we as journalists can do in terms of searching for public records, but anybody can do. It's an interesting point, I think, because there's a lot of journalism being done on maybe the periphery right now of what the traditional industry has been. You've got a lot of maybe independent journalists, whether they're working with an organization or even on their own. And obviously, I think some people in traditional journalism will look at some of these independent journalists and think, is it really journalism or not, depending on how they're presenting it. But there's this whole new space where anybody can be a journalist. That doesn't mean they're all practicing journalism the way we've traditionally been trained. But Alyssa, on that front, what do you think that the journalists today can learn from some of these 21st century media makers who share this content on social media and other, non-traditional news outlets? Because you do see people in these more non-traditional outlets practicing this same sort of discipline, trying to get records requests. Again, with mixed results. Some of it maybe isn't as trained in the disciplines of journalism, but what do you think journalists can take away from what we're seeing on that front this day and age?
It's such a great point, because I think there's a big conversation to be had about what's journalism and what's not. And I specifically like the term media makers, because anybody can make media, but that doesn't make you a journalist. So I think we can parse the language all we want, but also for audiences, they very well may not know the difference. And I think we need to always carry that with us as, a reminder. I think we all probably have friends and relatives who will call people journalists, and we're like, wait, why are you calling that person a journalist? They're just a commentator or an editorial person or whatever, right? But understanding and coming in with the context that we have that knowledge, but our audience likely does not, is really, I think, critical to how we present ourselves. And what I will say is a lot of very popular social media makers are authentic. They're relatable. They connect at a human level with people. And I think journalists can make a lot of assumptions, and this speaks to what Chip was saying earlier about what people know about how we do our work. So that idea of showing as you go, explaining how you're getting information, it ties into, I think, just our general human curiosity. Like, how do you know that? How did you get there? And I think we can help build our audiences by taking them on that journey and including them in the, hey, you want to file a FOIA with me? Let's set up a Facebook chat or a Facebook Live, and I'll show you how to do it. What are you concerned about? Again, keeping that focus on what is helpful and in service of community, because people will really remember that. And people will remember you as the person who opened that door for them and who actually cared enough and considered them enough as an equal. I think that's the other thing that I used to see a lot in journalism. It was sort of like, well, I'm a journalist, you're not worthy. I can't talk to you. I won't respect whatever you create. And I think those kinds of barriers don't do us any good. And I think we need to take seriously that there are a lot of options for people to get information. And I think ways that we can show that we're different from other kinds of sources of information that may or may not be accurate is to really bring people along on that journey. And I think we can also learn through the popular folks and folks who are really consistent with their audiences, how important it is to be in conversation with people and not just have this one-way street. And that's really hard for journalists because we've got a lot of different demands than somebody who's a blogger or doing a TikTok or an Instagram video. Yes. And we can learn the importance of being responsive to our audiences and even be able to enlist people's support for getting answers, as we were talking about before, with the idea of sort of that FOIA pressure that we can exert with the power of community. So rather than thinking of the community as the other, thinking of the community as all of us, I think is another way to kind of break down those barriers and really allow community members to see why they should trust us and how what I would say traditional journalism, but what journalism with a code of ethics looks like as opposed to media on the street.
And I think this is a good time to remind people, and we will again at the end as well, that whether you're a traditional journalist or a new era media maker, you can enter the awards for the regional Emmy chapters. The Central Great Lakes Emmys contest is open right now, as is the Ohio Valley, until January 31st. If you're in the Central Great Lakes community, which encompasses Cleveland, Indianapolis, Toledo, Fort Wayne, Erie, PA, the Ohio Valley Emmy chapter, their contest is up until March 3rd, encompassing Columbus and Cincinnati and different parts of Kentucky and West Virginia, including Lexington and Louisville, and some in Indiana as well. Quick plug there for our regional Emmy chapters with the contests underway, because we do start to see more and more non-traditional media outlets entering these contests and creating media. And Chip, building on that point, where do you think we're headed in this space in journalism? Do you think we'll continue to see more and more of this type of independent journalism being produced, and what are the lessons and things we need to keep in mind as that trend continues to grow?
Well, I think as platforms have continued to become more democratized, you've got people now making serious money. Some people on Substack, they're doing their own journalism or content for themselves with their own monetization engine. That's always a good thing to see, because it might encourage other people with other voices to do the same thing. It's always been tough to find out how to get paid in this business. And some people don't need to get paid. They create content because they have a position or a stake or an opinion or a financial interest, right? They do that for these other reasons. We as professionals and as journalists often do it in part because we love it and in part because we want to get paid. So finding models for different people, and like Alyssa said, we love content creators who also have a sense of ethics behind them. And that's not everybody. But that's why it's important for us to nurture our own community and find ways, whether it be working for a traditional outlet or working in a large newsroom or finding ways of doing responsible journalism on your own. And no matter where you came from, you don't need an education, you don't need a degree. It's nice to have those things. I teach college now. I want people with journalism degrees, but you don't have to have one. One thing I'll actually go back to on that as well is just an advice for a reporter. You're looking for a way of getting into a market. And
Yeah.
this kind of goes into what we've been talking about with connecting with the public and being transparent, being honest, is one of the things you can do if you're brand new into a market or you're brand new to a role or to a beat is to FOIA or file an open records request listing all the other open records requests that had been made with that agency in the last 30, 60, 90 days.
Might be
That's
a story in there.
FOIA-able thing.
Yeah.
And what you learn, a couple of things that you learn. One is, well, maybe your competitor's already on a story. That's a good thing just for that. But you also learn what residents or interested parties for your community care about. Now, again, some of those may be purely self-interest. I might do a open records request asking about the property next door to mine because I certainly have an interest being a neighbor. Maybe I have an interest being an owner, right? There's things along those lines, or maybe I'm trying to get a contract for the city or whatever. There's business, but those are also good stories, by the way. But what you learn, the other thing you learn is journalists in many communities, don't file the majority of requests. And they're not just sitting there waiting for a request. They're often doing lots of requests, but they come from all different corners. And so understanding what else is happening in that city via open records requests can be very useful for a journalist coming in and learning how that city works.
Great advice there, no doubt. Kris, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the things that your organization does. Right now, you've maybe seen some of the news about the Washington Post reporter who had their home raided for information. Your organization at the national level putting out a statement on that recently. Bruce Brown, the president of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, made this statement afterwards, saying physical searches of reporters' devices, homes, and belongings are some of the most invasive investigative steps that law enforcement can take. There are specific federal laws and policies at the DOJ that are meant to limit searches to the most extreme cases because they endanger confidential sources far beyond just one investigation and impair public interest reporting. He says, well, we won't know the government's arguments about overcoming these steep hurdles until the affidavit is made public, and part of that process is ongoing. He says this is a tremendous escalation in the administration's intrusion into the independence of the press. So, Kris, while I know you're not working on this case specifically, I want to get some general thoughts from you on, obviously this being a rather extreme example of a way in which a journalist's rights can be impeded by the government. But what's your advice generally for ever coming across a situation like this and the kind of legal representation that might be available or advice from or support from organizations like yours to ensure that journalists' rights are protected?
So yeah, thanks, Dan. That story, that case, although I'm not working on it directly, I know that my colleagues, that was last week was pretty chaotic, and everybody was really working together to respond as quickly as possible to that. And I think, from our perspective as an organization and me here in Indiana, so Indiana is my focus and where I work exclusively. But, for any journalist that hears this, we have a legal hotline, and that is on our website, rcfp.org. And a situation like this is we treat this sort of thing as an emergency, just as we would if a journalist or a photographer was arrested. So that we treat that as an emergency, and our hotline, which is on our website, and it's pretty straightforward to use, is I would recommend everybody do that if anything extreme like this happens. But you're right, this is a little bit of an outlier, and a lot of the work that we do, I would encourage everybody to check out our legal guides. We offer trainings, and this is all outside of legal representation, right? I mean, it's just one of the things we do. But We have open government guides. We put out guides for news gathering. Two of our most recent ones have been regarding covering protests. And we have an immigration guide that we put out in the spring. And these are all being updated as things go on. But we have a lot of resources, and they're digestible. They're written with the idea that folks that are going to be out working in the field could use this. So we have a lot of resources, and the organization offers trainings on all of the topics that we cover. So while everything might not be as hesitate to use the word extreme, but when we have journalists' homes being raided by the FBI, I think that's even though it's an outlier, but all the other issues that journalists might face as they do their jobs in news gathering, we have resources available, and it's all free. It's all on our website. Folks in Indiana can reach out to me directly, but we have a team that's constantly monitoring our hotline. So I would encourage everybody to, if they take nothing away from what I'm saying other than that, to check that out, because we have a lot of resources available.
Chip, what are your thoughts on what we're seeing there with this particular case and what it says about some of the dangers journalists might face, some of the places where their legal rights might be impeded? We have seen things like this in the past, but certainly troubling to see this particular development lately. What are your thoughts as a former news manager seeing something along these lines?
Yeah, listening to Kris talk about this is like, I'm only praying it's an outlier, right? I really do fear that what happened with the Post reporter is one of many that will follow. And I'm not an expert in this. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not in DC. But reading this week about how that the only thing that really has stopped anyone from doing what the federal government did in this particular case was, for instance, in the previous administration, a policy that said we won't do this. And then this administration that's currently in place just rips the policy away. So there's not a law. There's no act by Congress that says they have to behave in a certain way. And, I don't even know if efforts for a federal shield law, if we have, what's going on with that. I mean, it's been a state by state march, so those kind of protections really don't exist. And if there was a policy by one administration says we won't do this, well, that's nice. But the fact is we have to be girded that this may happen again and again.
Alyssa, your thoughts, it looked like you wanted to say something about all this as well.
I was just going to add it's a chilling effect, right? I think the goal here is to instill fear, is to instill a sense of maybe my rights aren't real as a journalist. And I think that's really dangerous. And I think one of the things that it's a power play as well. And I think one thing that is really helpful for journalists to do outside of DC and outside of the Washington Post is to, again, have that connection with their audiences and their communities so that their communities understand the importance of the protection of those sources and that information. I think, again, we make a lot of assumptions in the journalistic world that the general public understands the kind of work and information we're holding on to. So I think being more transparent about that makes it clear the importance of holding that information sacred. And I think, again, there's a huge generational shift in how people understand rights to access and information and what the government can and can't do. And I think it's up to us in the journalistic world to educate the public in a way that shows them, again, why this matters to them. If they can do this to us, what are they going to do to you? Right. And I think that making those connections is vital at every level, not just the national level, but especially at the local level.
Building on that, Kris, another question here that I don't believe we've asked yet. If a journalist is denied access to public records in the course of their reporting, what can they do to push back? Or if they were to encounter a more serious situation like the one we're describing here, what steps can journalists take to push back?
Sure. So with the, like I said, with the more serious situation like we saw last week, that again, I keep coming back to the hotline, but that for us, because like I said, if we're dealing with a journalist that's being arrested in the course of doing their job or something like this, it's in your best interest to reach out as quickly as possible. On the records front, again, it goes back to familiarizing yourself with the local or the state law where you work. Like I said, I'm in Indiana, and so Indiana is my focus. So Indiana has a couple different routes, but our public records law is enforced in the courts, but there is an administrative level office at the state government called the Public Access Counselor's Office that's available to file complaints over public records disputes. Not every state has an office like that. So I think one thing I would recommend, is in addition to familiarizing yourself with what exceptions are available to the government for what they're allowed to withhold, if you're denied access to records, I would encourage folks to reach out to us. If you're in Indiana, reach out to me. Because sometimes, I know this will shock everybody, but sometimes the exemptions and exceptions that are invoked for not disclosing something may not apply. So it's nice to have a resource, and that's what the Reporters Committee is here for. Yeah. If you have a question about that, reach out. But there's definitely avenues to push back.
Chip, do you want to see more organizations like Kris's, or more support from whether it be these sorts of journalistic organizations or journalism companies at the corporate level doing more right now to support journalists in situations like this? Do you think more needs to be done?
Well, there's always more that needs to be done. I will say, I think what I want to see more of is more journalists, and particularly young journalists, those who are new to the business, whether they're young or not, get involved with these organizations. So become a member of your regional NATAS chapter. That's a good place to start. Become a member of RTDNA or SPJ or of a state organization, right? And get involved. If you're grassroots, first of all, you're going to learn a lot more about this for your own business and your own journalism, but you're going to support that organization that's already doing a lot of work at that top level.
Another question here for Alyssa. I'll take this one to you as we talk about different ways journalists can stay connected to the community and how that helps journalists this day and age. What are some ways journalists can stay connected with community members to not only create more engaged and powerful stories, but also get real scoops from people on the ground?
Yeah, I would. I just want to very quickly add on to what Chip was saying, because joining an organization at whatever level of your professional career, it also helps you build that community of mentorship and understanding, so that if you get in a bind, you have the national resource, you have your state resource through the Committee to Protect Journalists, but you also have people surrounding you, because I think sometimes we forget that we are also community, right? We're reporting on and for community, but we are also community. So I just wanted to say that very quickly.
Absolutely.
And I think when it comes to how journalists stay connected with communities, number one, recognize you are a part of that community, right? You're not some outside force. So if there are ways you can show up when it's not for a story, what other parts of your community are you engaging with as a human? Right? And can you take a moment and go to a high school basketball game? Can you show up when you're not asking for something and you're not extracting information from people? Can you put are there regular places where you show up so that people know, I'm going to be working on FOIAs at the coffee shop, come join me? What are ways that you can create those kind of connections? Because that's how you build trust. You build trust through people, again, getting to know you, getting to know what your values are, what you're working toward. So they're not swayed by national or online conversations about fake news and enemy of the people. They'll be saying, no, that's the person that I saw at the coffee shop. That's the person that asked me what I thought about something. I mean, there are real ways to combat this. And I speak at the local level for the local level, because I think all of that resonates up from the grassroots. And without that grassroots as a sort of foundational representation of journalism in people's everyday lives, that shapes everything about how they see media writ large.
And Chip, you mentioned that earlier. Local journalism has that advantage. We're right there in the community. We're a part of the community. Do we need to do more to kind of help define ourselves as members of this local community we're covering?
I mean, it's critical. Those relationships. Alyssa's talked a lot about relationship building, and building relationships on your beat is one thing, but building relationships by just being present and active in other parts beyond your job is a joy of life for one thing, but it's also a great help for the business you're trying to build or the brand you're trying to establish. And a lot of the company I used to work for at Scripps, I'm very proud of the initiatives they've taken over the past several years to put reporters back into neighborhood beats and small community beats. It goes to the question of trust. I can ask, someone I just meet on the street, and say, do you trust the media? And they'll say, heck no. Do you trust, do you trust X and X network? No. Do you trust Channel 7? Do you trust so-and-so reporter who, oh yeah, that's the person who covers the news on my community. Yeah, that person does a really good job, right? And so you get a sense, the more you can build those connections person to person, where they can see that you're a person. By the way, you give them your cell phone number, you talk to them, you answer their questions on whatever forum you're happening to get together, you're present. You by yourself are never going to solve their distrust of the media. But you, day by day, you can help them solve the trust of who you are as a person and maybe the brand that you work for.
Yeah, there's an opportunity there for individual journalists to really elevate the trust people have in them, and by extension of the brand that you work for. Kris, do you think there would be benefit in seeing more journalists sort of work together when it comes to accessing public records? You sometimes see that where two organizations will kind of partner up on a particular story to dig into some of those public records and investigate it as part of a joint partnership. What have you seen? Have you seen that more and more? And do you think that's something that we'll continue to see more of in terms of organizations really kind of helping each other out and accessing some of these really important records?
Well, sure. I think there's benefit to strengthen numbers on that. For sure, particularly on if there's a particular story where there's a long timeline and you're trying to cover different types of records and different types of things. I've been with the Reporters Committee since March of 24, and as this practice in Indiana has built, I am seeing this happen right now, where we have different organizations that are working together jointly on and it frequently materializes in an investigative way so far. But I think there's a lot of benefit to that, and I think it should be considered to the extent that everybody is interested in that, because I think there's a real benefit to that. Like I said, strengthen numbers, and particularly on the public records front. I think that it'd be an incredible benefit to everybody.
Alyssa, do you agree? Strengthen numbers?
Oh, 100%. And just as we're talking, I'm thinking how awesome of a collaboration it would be to work with community members to do this kind of work, right? There's no barrier there. And I think any artificial barriers we have in terms of ownership of whatever, like that, we have to, and this is, again, my personal bias, is to let go of the hierarchies and just get to the truth and the stories that can help people in their lives, right? Let's get to the end result, to the action that will benefit us all. And if that means you've got community members who are already working on something, can you help them? Can you be the helper? Can you connect them to resources? Can you be a resource? And I think if we look at it in that more community-minded way, all of a sudden, again, it's less us and them and more about the bigger we that has a whole lot at stake right now in understanding what's happening in our governments, whether it's local, regional, national, international, and what roles we can play and what actions we can take to move our futures in the direction that we want it to go.
And particularly in this day and age where we're seeing more of these independent journalism organizations, I know, we've done some things at our television stations where we partnered with a group called State Affairs Indiana on a couple of investigations. Chip, I know the Scripps stations there in Ohio have partnered with the Ohio Capitol Journal on some of the State House reporting in the past. How important is that, do you think, for larger organizations, smaller independent organizations to sometimes work together?
Well, I mean, the fact is there's so many more organizations now, and some of them are very niche, which is great. I mean, in Texas, we have the Texas Tribune that has done a lot at being a digital organization, being a new organization, being independent of kind of other traditional media, but yet they partner with them, right? ProPublica is amazing at doing partnerships. So, where they aren't the only person with the byline on a project, there's other named or sometimes smaller brand people working with them on a particular place. And particularly when even a great organization like ProPublica or Texas Tribune, or even one of our large traditional newspapers or television stations can't do something on them by themselves to leverage the expertise and the strengths of another journalist or another journalism company. That's a really good place to be when you get sometimes, the sensibilities and the experiences of one organization paired with very different sometimes sensibilities and experiences from somebody else.
Well said. Some final thoughts as we get ready to wrap this up here this afternoon. It's been so great to have this panel come together to talk about these really important topics in journalism: accessing public records, the power of information more broadly, the power of building a community. Kris, some final thoughts from you. I'll start with you on what journalists need to be doing in this important time for our industry to really take what we're doing to the next level and make sure that we know how to do the things that help make us better journalists, help get better information to people, and while also being mindful of our legal rights as journalists.
Yeah, that is a tough question. I would say, keep your head up. I know that this is it's been a particularly, trying time for a lot of journalists here as of late. But I think it's important to realize that there is a community there, and there's organizations that have your back and are there for you, so you can do the work that you need to do. And it's such important. It's so important, perhaps now as much as it ever has been. And so, again, like for our organization, what our goal is always, our primary goal is to make sure that journalists can do the work that they're doing and try not to worry about some of these other issues to the extent that we can help. And so, like I said, we have a community there. Keep your head up. I know it's, it can be tough, but there's people here that are on your side and can help you out. And particularly with the legal stuff, the Reporters Committee is here for that as well, nationwide.
Yeah, thank you for not only being with us here today, but for all the great work your organization does. Alyssa, some final thoughts from you on that front?
Yeah, I would say, again, sort of echoing the idea of collaboration and the idea that none of us are in this alone and we don't have to be in it alone. And I think that can be and should be a comfort to people, because I think divisiveness is contagious. And the more we can show unity in our missions and values and purpose, the better off we all are and the stronger we all are. And I think the other thing that we talk a lot about in our work at A Picture's Worth is the idea of accountability. It extends not only to your audiences, to the general public, to your bosses, but to yourself. How are you making sure that you are taken care of through this process? Because it is stressful, and a lot of journalists are seeing some really awful things happening in front of their very eyes. And again, reminding those folks, you're not alone. It's not wrong to have feelings. We are also human in this business, and finding ways to express that, to refill and refuel so that you don't burn out, because that is exactly, I think, the point of some of this chilling effect kind of strong arm tactics, is that you just give up. And I think you need to be able to approach this with the heart that's open, but also protected in that community space, and also know what you need, ask for what you need, and remember you're also accountable to yourself and taking care of yourself through this whole process.
Well said. Chip, you get the last word here. What are you telling your students heading into journalism about the place we're in right now and where you'd like to see things go?
Well, I'll speak on behalf of my students, but also on behalf of all my professional friends in here, is that we need our students. There are not enough students coming into journalism schools, and so our schools will be challenged if they don't recruit, and we can't convince people that this is a great career to get into. I'm still in it for 40 years. I'm an outlier in that regard, but I would never have done anything different. I will still make that same choice again today, and I try to inspire them to think like this can be a great career for you to have as well. It gets challenging, stress and burnout among our people that are in this job right now. As Alyssa said, you kind of run out of fuel, right? And you're also tempted to do easier work for probably more money, but it's not the same, right? And so trying to convince that journalist who's been doing it for 2 years or 5 years or 10 to stick with it. We need those early career people to see the value once they've kind of had their taste of it professionally. And once, by the way, they may have discovered it's really hard, to stick with it, because we need them. We need them. For my Texas friends, I'll offer this. The Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas, or FOIFT.org, is an amazing resource of lawyers and journalists and other interested parties who want to help you get access to records and meetings if you think you're being stopped. They have a hotline to help you with Texas things. So make sure that you take advantage of that. Go look at their website now, become familiar with them. And there are people that are ready to help you with the things that you might need that you're not getting because somebody says you can't have that when you know you really can.
Yeah, it's great advice from our panel today. We really appreciate it. Speaking of websites, one more time, rcfp.org, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Our thanks to Kris for telling us everything about their organization. Picturesworth.org is where you'll see the work that Alyssa leads up there in Cincinnati, doing some incredible storytelling there. And again, a reminder, if you're looking to enter the regional Emmy Awards here in the Ohio Valley or Great Lakes Emmy chapter, we've got all the information there on the chapter website. You can look right now to figure out what you need to do to get all of your information together to enter the contest there at GreatLakesEmmys.tv. That goes until January 31st. That's the deadline to enter in the Central Great Lakes chapter, which is Indianapolis, Cleveland, Toledo, Youngstown, Fort Wayne, Erie, Pennsylvania. And if you're in the Ohio Valley chapter, the deadline to enter, you got a little bit more time. It's until March 3rd, but the contest is now open there in the Ohio Valley chapter, Cincinnati, Columbus, Dayton, Lexington, Louisville, parts of West Virginia, parts of Indiana as well. Our thanks to the panel today. This has been a really great conversation. We also want to thank some of our other partners who've shared some of this today, including the Indiana Broadcasters Association, the Ohio Association of Broadcasters, and the Kentucky Broadcasters Association. It's been an honor to bring this to you on behalf of the Ohio Valley chapter and the Central Great Lakes chapter today. And our thanks again to our wonderful panel. You all were amazing. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much for being here with us today. We'll see you again next time. You've been watching Navigating Journalism, the Power of Information. You can watch all of this back on our chapter's website and YouTube pages if you want to see more from the panel. Thanks again for joining us.